Good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to those who made it to our first Business Environment Working Group webinar on public procurement for SMEs. I'm happy that quite many people joined. The reason why we started we wanted to do a webinar series is twofold. One is to spread really the wealth of resources that are available that the Business Environment Working Group worked on and make it available to a larger audience. And second, also to create a forum for further discussion, for exchanging best practices or ideas on new fields that we should work on, etc. And maybe as a very short introduction, hold on, I need to get to the next slide. The Business Environment Working Group is one of the oldest working groups in the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development and has been working in particular, let's say one of the most important guidance it issued was in 2008. All agencies agreed on a practical guidance on how to support business environment reform with certain key messages and principles to respect when advising on such a reform that is available on the website. And since then, since the guidance is still, let's say, very broad, and we worked on several specific issues that looked at, for example, how business environment reform can promote formalization or how it can be complemented with industrial policy support, how it can be measured, the links to quality infrastructure, and then we also look, for example, at supporting business environment reforms within industry sectors. What is the difference versus looking only at, let's say, business environment reform in general? We looked at the specific gender issues in detail 2 years ago, and last year we looked at business environment reform and the link to labor productivity and public procurement, and that is the reason why we chose also this topic, because it's one of the most recent work items that we worked on. And therefore, I'm happy to welcome you to this 1-hour webinar. And in particular, I'm very happy to welcome 2 of our main speakers. The first speaker will be Tanya Gossain from the World Bank Group. She will give us an overview of why public procurement is important for SME development. She's been with the World Bank Group since 2008. Until December 2017, Tanya was leading the World Bank's global projects on benchmarking public procurement as well as procuring infrastructure PPPs. And as of January this year, Tanya moved into the global business regulations team, where she is a senior global specialist advising governments on how to improve their business and public procurement regulations. And the second speaker will be William Nielsen. William Nielsen is the lead author of the technical report that had been elaborated by last year on policies that promote SME participation in public procurement. The report was written on behalf of the DCED Business Environment Group, and Will works as a consultant for the World Bank Group, providing research and analysis in areas of public procurement, inclusive business, business informality, and others. Furthermore, he's the founder of a startup as well as the Democracy Lab in Costa Rica, a think tank focused on turning information into knowledge for citizens to better enable their participation in their own governance. These 2 inputs, I suggest that we have short clarification questions at the end of each input. If you have an urgent question during one of these presentations, don't hesitate to type it into the chat box. I suggest that everybody who's not speaking is muting their microphones, because we can hear some background noises already at the moment. So best would be really to mute the microphone, and then let's say in the general discussion, I'm happy to take on your questions via the mic or via the chat box. Nick will help me a bit because I can't see all the chats, so he will help me with this. And I would hand over right now, if there's directly to Tanya to start giving us an introduction.
Thank you, Stephanie. So let me just do this. I don't know if you can see my screen, or maybe not.
Not yet. I'm just passing over. If you perhaps.
Oh, you are now.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see.
See, she's gone to the wrong person. Perhaps if you just want to start, and it'll just come along in a second. Just loading now.
Oh, okay. So good morning, everybody. Stephanie, thank you for the introduction and for hosting this webinar. It's great to see so many interested participants. So as you mentioned, the reason that I'm here today is because I'm going to try to put some context into why public procurement is important for private sector development growth, particularly for SMEs. So public procurement is a significant driver of development and economic growth. First of all, given due to the magnitude, the financial magnitude of the public spending that is involved, but also because of all the sectors that it impacts. It is estimated that the volume of public spending accounts for 1/5 of the global GDP. And when we put this into dollar amount, we're talking about approximately $9.5 trillion spent purchasing goods and services every year. So looking just at developing countries, they spend an estimated $820 billion a year, and they are spending money that is taxpayers' money. So they reach out to the private sector, including SMEs in a variety of sectors, to purchase goods and services in order to deliver services for their citizens. And when we look at the different sectors, you know, this can range from food for welfare programs to wiring for electrical grid to you know, larger infrastructure projects. And then if you look at, for example, the global construction sector, it is estimated, according to the OECD, it is estimated that by 2020, annual losses because of inefficiency and mismanagement in public spending could reach $2.5 trillion. So we're talking about a lot of waste and lots of opportunities. Despite the importance of the topic, global information around public procurement is still not there. Although in the past decade, public procurement has increased tenfold, and this growth trajectory is expected to continue. Global information, at least comparative information about how countries are conducting their procurement, is still not there. The World Bank has been taking the lead on diagnosis and analysis in order to fill this knowledge gap. So you will see in front of you on the screen the two reports that have been produced. The first one is the benchmarking public procurement that you mentioned earlier. And this project was done at the request, it's demand-driven, it was done at the request of the G20 anti-corruption group, and it presents an assessment of public procurement systems across 180 countries, but looking at the issue from the angle of the private sector with a particular focus on SMEs. The second one is a report that was commissioned by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, and that looks at the policies that promote SME participation in public procurement. And it's a spin-off. It uses some of the benchmarking public procurement data. So how does public procurement impact SMEs' growth? Why should we focus on public procurement? Why should we put it on the global agenda? Public procurement is one of the key regulatory areas that has the potential to really make or break firms. So in developing countries, public procurement could be the single largest marketplace for SMEs because due to the volume of purchases done by the government. So if public procurement systems are improved, losses can then be converted into opportunities. There was a recent World Bank study, I believe it was done in 2017, that uses firm-level data in 88 countries, gathering data from 34,000 firms. And it does an assessment, and it shows that better procurement systems matter more for SMEs than for larger firms. So if we are looking at a multinational company versus a small and medium enterprise, actually the SME is really more impacted by the public procurement policies and regulations. Another study conducted in Brazil shows the correlation between SMEs' participation in public markets and the growth of firms. So the study does an assessment and then shows that winning at least one bid, one tender, or more in a given yearly quarter was found to increase firms' growth by 2.2 percentage points. So in both cases of procurement reforms and SME-specific assistance, SMEs' engagement was found to increase in the public markets. So what are the main impediments, in a nutshell, that SMEs are facing in the procurement process? From the benchmarking public procurement analysis that we have conducted across 180 countries, some impediments keep on repeating themselves across different countries that have different development levels. So, and these impediments emerge as being particularly challenging for SMEs. The first one that I'm going to briefly mention is the access to information. So access to information is critical for all firms, including SMEs, because an asymmetry of information will lead to firms missing opportunities, and it will simply distort the competition and the level playing field for suppliers. So access to information should be publicly promoted, and information should be publicly available and possibly free of charge in order not for SMEs to incur transaction costs. The second area that comes as a big challenge for SMEs is the digitization of procurement processes. So having electronic services throughout the tendering process, so we're talking about the pre-tendering all the way to signing the contract online, not only reduces or even eliminates transaction costs, but it also enhances transparency. So in that sense, SMEs would be more encouraged and able to take part in the tendering process when it is taking place online. That will also result in trust increasing from these firms because they know that the process is done in a fair and transparent manner, and also in how the public funds are being spent. The third area is bid security deposit and other financial constraints such as performance guarantees, for example, that governments impose on firms, especially on SMEs. So here, the World Bank is not advocating for removing these safeguards because also they are useful for securing the seriousness of bidders and suppliers. But what we're asking governments to do is please regulate it because they can add a substantial expense for SMEs. So whenever there is a bid security deposit requirement, for example, whenever it's required, it should be regulated by law and not left to the discretion of the procuring entity, and the amount should be fairly reasonable. Finally, payment delays. So payment delays is really an issue in most countries that we have looked at, and it can range from 3-4 months all the way to taking more than half a year for suppliers to be paid after the work has been completed and the invoice has been submitted. The recognized good practice in that particular area is to pay suppliers within 30 days after the completion of work. And obtaining payment in a timely manner is not only critical for suppliers that are waiting to be paid. You know, if I am an SME and I want to, you know, I complete the work, I have salaries to pay, I have a business to run, and I need this constant flow of cash coming into the business. So recurring delays in payment when doing business with the government will really deter SMEs from responding to call for tender in the first place. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to Will. I'll be happy to take any questions.
So are there any immediate questions that you would like to ask Tanya before we move on to Will? If not, I would suggest that Will continues giving us a detailed insight into his report and the options and best practices that he looked at into greater detail, and then we do an overall discussion at the end.
Certainly, I can jump in then. Can you see my screen now?
Can't see your screen now. Well,
okay, let's see.
Should be a share screen button.
Here we go. Hopefully it's coming through.
Yep, great. Can see that perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, so, well, thank you, Stephanie and Tanya, for your presentations and support on this project. Thank you, Nick, for helping us make it happen with this webinar. So I'll just continue on with the options and best practices that are relevant for these preferential public procurement policies. But to start out, then we'll look at a few initial policy considerations. And so these are just the points to take into account before you look into implementing a specific preferential procurement policy. As Tanya mentioned, there's oftentimes bigger factors than the specific policy within the procurement process that are limiting an SME's ability to participate. And so some of the things to take into account include the overall functioning of the procurement system. There's a variety of legal and regulatory components that are all impacting the process, as well as different institutions within the government that have different responsibilities for different components of procurement. And they often have different agendas in terms of efficiency, if they want to minimize cost, if they want to maximize social impact. Sometimes those components work against each other. And so it's important to recognize where people have different agendas. But then next also is understanding the definitions in terms of what SME means for your particular policy. So different groups will have a different target business group in mind when they think of a preferential policy. If they're more geared towards the micro enterprise side of things, if they're looking at a specific sector, they want to foster the small manufacturing firms. Each of those different companies will respond differently to different preferential policies. Then briefly, just free trade agreements, something to keep in mind depending on the country you're interested in supporting a preferential policy in. These can place restrictions on their ability to favor certain firms over others, and I'll mention that a little more later on here. Then, of course, the standard barriers and risks. Big one is often corruption in public procurement. We've seen the Odebrecht trial that started out in Brazil and has expanded throughout Latin America, I think, now. And so obviously it's going to be a big problem and something that should be taken account of throughout any reform within procurement. And then, of course, as with any policy, I'm discussing with the various stakeholders, especially the SMEs themselves, in terms of what barriers they're identifying as being the major issues to their participation. So from there, I'll jump into just a few of the major procurement policies you can choose from. In the report, we broke out policies into three main categories, moving from least intrusive to most intrusive in terms of how they affect the current market operations. So on the left-hand side is the core principles. These, we don't go into a lot of detail in these within the report. Many of these deserve a report in and of itself. Issues of transparency, integrity, anti-corruption. Tanya touched on these as well. But those are going to be major factors to take into account with any policy and the procurement system in general. And so oftentimes those can be the greatest underlying factor affecting an SME's willingness and ability to participate in public procurement. But so in the report we focus much more on these other two policy types, procurement reforms and then the SME specific assistance. So the procurement reforms are reforms that don't target directly SMEs, but instead focus on leveling the playing field. And in most cases, this leveling the playing field ends up disproportionately benefiting SMEs. And then within the SME specific, that's just as the name sounds, these policies provide support to SMEs and only SMEs, helping them better participate in public procurement. But so some of the major policies then that can be implemented, there's quite a range. We have several listed in the graphic here, but there's even more discussed in the report as well. So I recommend if some of these nitty-gritty details are of interest, feel free to check those out. But within procurement reform, the E-Procurement Platforms are a huge development. They can affect every aspect of the procurement process and really enable an SME to quickly access information regarding a bid opportunity. They can submit their bids through the platform, receive payment through the platform. So it can be a major cost-cutting tactic, both for the government as for SMEs that are likely going to have reduced administrative capacities compared to much larger firms. Then others, prompt payment reform. Tanya mentioned this as well, but oftentimes governments will formally reduce the amount of time it should take for a company to receive payment, and this can be a major factor in terms of whether the company wants to even bother participating in public procurement or not. In some cases, some governments even include penalties for delayed payments to try and help offset the burden of working with a long timeline for receiving payment. Within the SME specific ones, some of the major ones that are often discussed include the smaller lot sizes. So a government can break down contract sizes in order for SMEs to have the opportunity to bid. Oftentimes contracts are so large that a small business will have no chance of even being able to fulfill that order. So it automatically precludes them from participation. Some other common ones are the set-asides or quotas. Many countries use these, and they're just essentially setting aside a certain percentage of the country's procurement budget that will be for SMEs. So SMEs will only compete against other SMEs to win those contracts. Other alternatives are the bid price preference, which gives a discount to SMEs submitting a bids to help them be on a more cost competitive stance relative to large firms. Let's see, there's quite a variety of training and technical assistance programs that can be done. This is often going to be specific to the local context and the specific barriers that a small business may face to participate. But the training can also be targeted towards the procuring agency itself within the government, helping them build up professional capacity so that there's standardization of implementation of these policies, and that helps build the integrity and transparency and so on that we mentioned previously as well. If anybody has questions on these, I can definitely get back to them. There's quite a few different policies to run through, so for the sake of time, we'll keep moving forward. Within the report then, we focused on 3 main countries and their case studies with the Republic of Korea, India, and Mexico. I don't want to get it, there's a lot of information on this page, I realize that, but the main point I wanted to show was that many of these countries are working with a whole variety of different preferential procurement policies targeting SMEs. In some cases, it's a dozen or more different policies. Oftentimes, they're implemented relatively simultaneously as well. So in some cases, this can make it difficult to understand which policies are going to be more impactful than others. but oftentimes the policies implemented are trying to support SMEs all along the procurement process cycle to facilitate their participation. But then the other thing to note then is that there's often quite a few different contexts and institutional or organizations within the government that have a role in these policies. So there's a lot of balancing that has to take place whenever looking to implement one of these preferential policies. And so here I'll quickly run through a few of the major lessons learned that were from the case studies and some of the impact. Tanya had touched on these as well, but so procurement reforms, as we define them here, tend to be best by efficiency standards, whereas SME targeted assistance is going to be best for maximizing engagement with the SMEs. However, there's a continual debate about the cost effectiveness of SME targeted assistance versus procurement reform. It's often really difficult to assess what you're getting for your money with some of those policies. Although, of course, the main thing is you're going to be spending more money on SMEs. So if that's the goal, that can be a promising route to pursue. One of the other main points in terms of learning, future learning, the set-asides, financial assistance, and small lot sizes tend to be the most commonly used preferential tools for SMEs, and that's actually based on the benchmarking public procurement survey that Tanya had discussed as well. So again, the cost effectiveness is still debated, but then another point I'll bring up, this is something we started to get into with our report, but that's the gender component. Oftentimes there will be overlap in terms of the potential barriers that a woman-owned small business will face compared to a male-owned small business, but the gender-specific component is something that has not received the study that it really deserves, and so that's something that we're going to be looking at more in the future as well. Now, the good practices, what you're all interested in, I'm sure. So, of course, the comprehensive, coordinated legal and regulatory framework, that's key for the procurement system as a whole. Then the e-procurement and the digitization, as we mentioned, for the most part, across the board, this is a positive step. There's a few cases that we came across. For example, in Malaysia, they had implemented an e-procurement platform. And while there wasn't an issue with the platform itself, the main issue was just that the small business managers weren't accessing the internet enough to be able to take advantage of the potential services that it could provide. So sometimes there's other factors to take into consideration beforehand, but overall, these e-procurement portals have been quite successful, especially for saving money for the government as well. Then minimizing size discrimination, this is particularly relevant for a lot of the procurement reforms we discussed, but looking at all the different ways where the procurement system is tilted towards large enterprises and how that, in terms of they have large administrative capacities, they can send somebody to meet in person with someone else to discuss a potential bid opportunity. Those types of things are all obstacles for a small business. Then, of course, if you're looking at a specific or SME-specific policy, it's best to make sure you can align that with the core procurement principles, transparency, anti-corruption, and so on, just because those are going to be the bigger factors in the long run that will influence SMEs' participation. And then also, if you're looking at one of these policies, understanding the sectors that SMEs tend to work in, what capabilities they have, in terms of how you want to foster their participation will be important to understand. And now a few little ways donors and development agencies can support this. Throughout most of those good practices, there's opportunities. Some of the major ones that we identified previously is just that providing funding or support on research and surveys to understand the SME markets in terms of what sectors they tend to work in, where they deserve the most support, what demographics might consist of for these small business owners. Then, of course, assessing the existing procurement processes where there's major holdups, issues, if there's bottlenecks in these types of processes, these could be good points to address before taking a further step with a more SME-targeted policy. Of course, local obstacles for SMEs are relevant. Many governments may request outside or technical support in terms of implementing large-scale online platforms that will support SMEs. And then oftentimes for policies, of course, we like to look at political economy in terms of where agendas lie. Certain political groups may have different agendas for who should be supported and who shouldn't, and interests, long-standing interests may be opposed to certain policies being implemented. And along those same lines then, these future research needs, donors and development agencies can definitely support on these too. It's just that for some of these learnings, they may not be as country-specific, but as we've mentioned, there's overall lack of in-depth, rigorous studies that look into these preferential procurement policies. And then, as we mentioned before, it'd be great to see more women-specific preferential policies. But one point also, we didn't discuss this as much, but it's something that will be important to look at more in the future, and that's just understanding the diversity of enterprises within the SME sector. In most countries, SMEs are making up 99% of the firms in the country, so expecting that a single preferential policy is going to reach that whole group of enterprises and affect them similarly is, of course, a little far-fetched, so it's important to understand the variety within the sector and what business groups you're really interested in targeting. So from there, I will close. But can definitely take any questions or comments you can have, and then definitely if we don't get to it, feel free to email me as well.
Thank you very much, Will, for this interesting presentation, and I'm sure there's much more that you could have said, given that it was a very, very complex technical report, and you put a lot of effort in it. So I would open the floor first for any comments, share your questions, insights, learnings, own experience, if you found something contradictory. Just unmute your microphone if you want to speak directly, or type into the chat box. And if no one wants to start, maybe I can start with a question. I mean, you looked at 3 specific case studies that you met, and you said, well, there's still a need to go, the lack of rigorous studies. I wondered whether, I mean, the case studies you looked at were Korea, India, and Mexico. I wondered, aren't there also case studies that we could look at more closely in, for example, Africa? Because, for example, for our ministry, the BMZ, Africa is at the moment the continent that we focus on, and especially we also, what you mentioned when you said, well, it's important to understand existing SMEs, the variety, the market, who's in there. That's exactly what we also try to look at. What are actually within the SME sector, the SMEs with the potential to grow, to the ones that we want to target specifically. So I wondered whether you came across any examples in Africa that would be also worthwhile working on.
Sure, yeah. So we did look at, we have a couple, or throughout the report, I guess we did really brief blurbs that look at a variety of different countries. And some of them then were in Africa that we looked at, and there was a couple that we were considering pursuing bigger or more extensive case studies on, such as Kenya and South Africa, and there may have been 1 or 2 others as well that we were looking at as well. But the part of the issue with building out these types of case studies, and I would differentiate these case studies from the type of rigorous analysis I mentioned that we need more of, is that with some of these case studies and where information exists, the extent of the information, if we have it, is the amount of money that went to the SME, how much money might have been spent, but very rarely do we understand the effects of that, of the SME winning the contract, of long-term impacts on the firms or on the sector as a whole in terms of growth and productivity, and but then also we often very rarely know what the costs are to the government and how it's different than it could have been. So that's one of the main issues. And so for some of these cases, and Tanya mentioned the study in Brazil where they discovered that there was actually this small increase in growth for the small businesses that win a contract. That was one of the, and continues to be one of the very few studies that we've come across that has a, takes an experimental or a quasi-experimental approach to understanding the benefits of an SME winning the contract. So that, yeah, the lack of info throughout has been a little bit of an issue if you want to know the in-depth good you're creating, I suppose.
That's true. I'm not sure whether you saw the questions in the chat box. Simon asked whether you could elaborate a bit on the trade-offs with preferential treatment of SMEs. He'd like to know more about the advantages and disadvantages of this, whether there's published evidence. I mean, you mentioned a bit already now. And the second question is for both Tanya and Will, whether do we know who benefits more from improving procurement, the government or SMEs?
Sure, okay. I can, let's see. Sure, I'll see if I can address Simon's question. So the advantages and disadvantages of the preferential treatment. I'd say one of the main topics that is continually discussed in the literature is especially regarding the SME-specific policies, and that's how cost-effective are they if you're just throwing money at it, at small businesses for the sake of, because everybody will be politically on board with that type of policy. Although there's little follow-up in terms of, as I mentioned, how much good you're creating with that. The advantages, so one of the good points within this public procurement process, with especially with some of the procurement reforms, is that in addition to facilitating SMEs' engagement with the procurement process, in many cases you're facilitating improved governance as well throughout these variety of initiatives, and such as the professionalization of public procurement, building integrity. When small businesses develop that trust with the government, that can spill over into a variety of other aspects in terms of their engagement with the governance, participation, voting, etc. So those are just a couple points I would mention then. Who benefits more from improving? Yeah, that's, I would say with that, in terms of who benefits more from procurement, of course the government needs these goods or services regardless, but it's just if they can expand some level of socioeconomic impact with it, nobody is going to be opposed to that type of benefit. And so I think it also depends on the specific policy that you're looking at in terms of who's improving procurement. With some of the e-procurement platforms that have looked at studies, there's been estimates of pretty significant cost savings on the part of the government and the administrative costs to manage a bidding process and manage a contract and make payments and so on. But then, of course, there's the SMEs that they have a specific set aside just for them. I know that continues to be quite popular, and it makes for it's a reserved marketplace, especially for them, which in most cases is going to benefit them more than it may benefit the government. Let's see.
Yeah, then there's another question from Umesh Menon. SMEs are mostly single product manufacturers. They have a difficulty in getting VAT refunds on their inputs when they sell to the government. Any insights to this?
So, hello?
Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, let me just jump in to react to Anastasia's question. First of all, I didn't mention that earlier, but the USAID has been instrumental in making the benchmarking public procurement project happen. It supported it over 3 years of time, and Anastasia reminded us of this now in the chat. So thank you so much for this. In terms of improvement, who benefits more? I think it's not only a two-way, like two-stakeholder transaction, if you want. So there is improvement. I agree with Will. It depends on like on what type of policy you're looking at. It's also I mean, the government is benefiting from improving its procurement system. It's getting better value for its money, but it's also the citizens who are benefiting from this. So you have the SMEs who are getting opportunities that otherwise they would miss. You will also get benefit from like there will be more accountability on the government, and the citizens' funds are better spent. Will, I don't know if you want to maybe touch upon the V80 refund and the SMEs being a single product manufacturer.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's something I think I would have to look into in more detail to have a good response on. Yeah.
So we did look at this particular aspect when we were doing our analysis. I know that there are a number of impediments that SMEs face. We, unfortunately, given that we were doing a global study, we couldn't look at all of them. So I'm sure that the ones that we have mentioned, the payment delays and access to information, are only few examples of many other issues that SMEs are facing. And then the other point that I think was mentioned was the one about capacity building for SMEs and training. Yeah. Do you want to? I can say what the bank is doing, but like if you want to, I don't know if you want to add anything with.
Sure. I mean, I can go after you though. No problem.
Oh, okay. So Ram and Umesh, I agree with you. It's very important for SMEs to build some capacity around how to enter the procurement, how to navigate the complexity of the procurement market. At the bank, not my unit, but other colleagues are doing a lot of capacity building and workshops for. They are working with local chambers of commerce. They are working with industry associations and bringing together not only government officials, but also private sector stakeholders and SMEs. I know that a workshop was conducted in Morocco, I believe, a few months ago, and they had a large number of participants. And they sat along the government to kind of like walk them through what a typical tender would be. So they would, like there would be a lot of information exchange, and there will also be a lot of questions answered and a lot of learning, peer-to-peer learning from these firms.
Mm-hmm. I can add just a little bit then. We came across a few examples of this capacity building that you're mentioning here. So within the report, then we talked a little bit about the training and technical assistance as one of the SME-specific tools you can use. One of the examples that I know that comes to mind right off is in Italy. They have the supplier training desks. I think there's several hundred actually scattered around the country that's specifically for the SMEs and their ability to work with the government. In some cases, though, we saw this type of capacity building might not be as, they might have a public procurement support as a small component of a much larger managerial training or financial literacy training, that kind of thing, is in some cases, especially for the smaller businesses or micro businesses, there are some of this aspect of like financial literacy is one of the initial issues that the firm will run into in order to participate with the government marketplace. And so, yeah, I guess when in these cases that we saw, it's understanding what comes first in terms of how you're going to best be able to support the business participate in these contracts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And there's a new question from Teresa Rüth. She asks whether you also looked into a special treatment of inclusive businesses and social enterprises, whether there are any thoughts on distinguishing between social enterprises and traditional SMEs in public procurement?
Yeah, so we, within this report, it's not really a component of the report, although it's definitely something that has been receiving more attention. Within the preferential procurement, of course, can be used across a wide variety of different target businesses, and SMEs is just one among several. And so we've seen these examples of the inclusive business or social enterprise where they will incorporate certain award criteria to firms that display certain aspects, whether it's if they have a workforce training program as a part of their business operations, or if there's, it could be certain local content requirements, or if there's a certain ethnicity group that may be targeted. These can all often be built into the award criteria that a firm submits in their bid. But it wasn't the focus of the project itself.
Mm. Okay, thanks. I mean, I also would suggest if anyone from the audience has to add something on this point because they're working on any of those issues, then please do share your experience with us. There's another question. In terms of long-term growth and sustainability, did the SME case studies expand into other markets, like market differentiation beyond public procurement?
I might not be clear on what the question is speaking.
Yeah. Now there's another question from Israel Klug from the assessed case studies. Is there any evidence or examples where preferential treatment was implemented without being aligned with the core principles of public procurement, transparency and integrity? Could you point out different instruments, tools used to pursue these principles when implementing pure preferential? Is there any example from the cases which can support the assumption that pure competitive is less susceptible to corruption or misuse?
In terms of aligning the principles, that's I haven't yet come across. I mean, I think there are more general tools from a variety of some of the major groups, World Bank, OECD, and others that have reports regarding transparency and integrity. And from what we saw, it was important to take that into account, but in terms of specifically aligning it with the pure preferential is more of a general good practice. Maybe Tanya has other thoughts on that as well. And then regarding the pure competitive being less susceptible to corruption, yeah, one of the issues that had been brought up is that when there is pure preference, and you need to make sure that the definitions are very clear on both the side of the procuring agency as well as the businesses. As things get less and less clear, there's more and more room for this level of interpretation. And when that comes into play, then definitely there's this risk of the misuse.
Well, just to follow up on this, so Israel, thank you for your question. From when we were doing our assessment, we have not looked at that particular angle of preferential treatment. I'll be happy to look if the bank has done other, in-depth studies on that. Our group has not done this yet, has not looked at this particular angle, but I'm sure there must be some literature there. I'd be happy to look at that and revert back if I find anything.
Is there anything we forgot, or anyone who would like to ask another question? Simon asked, how about the private sector, large corporations? Can governments learn from the way mining companies, for example, procure? Is this done better in other sectors? Tanya, do you want to have a go?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I think that Simon raises a very good point, and that's actually an issue, like looking at the variation across sectors. It has been an issue that we have really struggled with when we were trying to conduct the assessment across a large number of countries. So the issues that you see, or like the good practices that you see implemented in some sectors, may not necessarily apply within one country, may not necessarily apply across different sectors. I'll just give you a very simple example, and the mining sector is actually a good one. But I'll just give you one example. In Chile, when we were looking at, so when we collected our data, we do standardized case study assumptions to be able to collect comparable data across countries. And what this means is that we look at a particular company in a particular, operating in a particular sector, and then we collect the data on how the procurement is being conducted from the angle of that particular sector. So we compare historical data, 1 year looking at the procurement of goods, the other year looking at the procurement of infrastructure and works, procurement of works. And we see huge discrepancy in the way the countries perform in their procurement system. So Chile, which is really what we consider as the best practice country in different levels when it comes to public procurement. So Chile Compra was one of the pioneers in doing digitization of of procurement systems. It has been used as a model for a best practice model in other countries. Looking at the procurement of works, we saw that, for example, when we were doing the assessment, things have changed now. When we were doing the assessment, we have seen that a lot of the services are not offered for one sector. They are only offered for small procurement and procurement of goods, or like for some type of service procurement, but not all of them. So, so it really depends on the sector, on the capacity. Some sectors are more strategic than others for some countries, and therefore additional restrictions are being set. So I think it really varies. What we try to do, and I think the other organizations are doing the same, is try to find something that could be used as a proxy for other sectors. So, and a sector that makes sense in terms of, private sector impediments. So if we are looking at, I don't know, the procurement of like buying pens for an office or computers for an office, it may not necessarily be an issue for firms and for SMEs to enter and compete in this market. The problems emerge when you have more money involved, when you have more strategic sectors involved, and when you have sectors that are where it's harder for SMEs to kind of like infiltrate and compete there. So that was kind of like the variable that we looked at, and I think what we have noticed is that there is a difference in how procurement is being handled across sectors in pretty much all the countries that we looked at around the world.
Thank you, Tanya. Jürgen just asked the question, or said a number of governments in sub-Saharan Africa offer preferential procurement of medicines to local manufacturers. I believe it's not covered in your study in particular, right? But did you come across studies on this specific issue in your work? I can only say from my side, I can try, Jürgen, to link you with we have a sector project on access to medication. I have to see what they work on, but the colleague is sitting across the floor, so I would link you to him. And I don't know whether Tanya has.
That's fine. I mean, no, we know them. We have been working jointly for some time. No, I mean, I do believe that there's probably nothing on this very specific topic. Otherwise, I might know about it, but it's always worth asking.
Yeah, we have not looked at the issue of procurement of health products. We stayed away from, as I mentioned, we stayed away from sectors that are really governed by very specific regulations, and I think health is one of them. Another one would be, for example, renewable energy, and we try to go with a sector that's more representative of larger spending within the government, and that could be used as a proxy.
Thanks.
Okay, there's an additional question from Rem. Splitting procurement up in smaller lots provides an advantage for SMEs as they can master smaller works and more SMEs can work on one procurement offer. However, the government agency, for the government agency, it will be more cumbersome to manage and supervise, and they have to work with more SMEs. So you need or you have a trade-off there. That's right. But if you have other goals, social or inclusive, like poverty reduction or inclusiveness, then the government maybe is also willing to take this trade-off. And Siobhan Kelly from FAO says, coming back to Jordan's question, did the study come across any cases where the government contract led to additional contracts beyond the public procurement contract, which ideally should be one of the objectives of preferential schemes? And I think Nick, yes, Will, yes, you had some information on that, if I remember correctly.
Yes. So in this regard, we saw, for example, in the case study in Brazil, I mean, not our case study, but the study that we referenced, they found that the small businesses, once they had won a government contract, it increased their likelihood of continuing to participate in future bidding opportunities, as well as increase their likelihood of winning future contracts.
Well, so I think we're almost at the end. If there are no more urgent questions, then I would like to thank our two speakers, Tanya and William, for the valuable input, and all of you for participating and exchanging ideas and views. And maybe some conversation will continue also bilaterally in the future from here. Nick just sent us a link. We would be very happy if you could complete a quick survey on this webinar on SurveyMonkey. It's just 3 or 4 questions, so it should take you more than half a minute to click the boxes. The reason is we plan to do a series, so we wanted to do another webinar in June, probably a more general one on the best practice guidance, but that's still to be confirmed. And we wanted to continue a series in September to December, and wanted to get a quick overview of which topics that the Business Environment Working Group has worked on would be of most interest to participants. So you would find a question there where you can click on the various possible topics, and it would be very helpful to get an idea of what's attractive. And maybe to close, the current work items that we work on at the moment is a study on business environment reform and SMEs. what is the rationale, what are challenges and best practices of BR oriented towards micro and small enterprises, and that draft should be completed by June. So if any of you is interested, you're also happy to share that later on. And we're conducting currently a study on the link between business environment reform and investment promotion, to understand the connection. How do they support each other? How do they complement? And that work is also still ongoing, but should be a first draft should be available in June. And with that, I would thank you all very much again, and you will receive an invitation to the next webinar series then 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye. Great. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.